So when trying to really understand the American form of government, it's really important to kind of take a look at these concepts related to democracy and how ultimately we are able to take democracy and all these things that need to happen in order for democracy to happen and work them into the republic that we have, right? Obviously, in order for us to have a system in which people can vote and everyone's voices are heard, there has to be some really foundational principles that we believe in as a country. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. So first, the first major concept of democracy is this idea of the worth of the individual, that every person within the democracy has value, and that everyone's opinions are essentially worth something, that it isn't like my opinion is worth more than yours, for example. Both of our opinions are simply different and both have value. There's a lot of people in the United States, and so it's really important that we be able to understand that everyone has value if we're going to really have a democracy in which everyone's votes sort of count. Um, the one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that as time has passed, that maybe there are certain people that are treated as more worthy than others in the United States. And let's take a look at that a little bit later in the semester. But now might be a really good opportunity to think, are we really treating everyone as equally worthy? So the next concept to take a look at is this idea of equality for all. And this, of course, comes from the Declaration of Independence statement that all men are created equal, which itself comes from John Locke, of course, and the Enlightenment thinking. Um, but this is the idea that everyone is essentially the same, and a king isn't an inherently better person than any other average Joe on the street. And so everyone really should be treated equally. And democracy really insists on the fact that people, regardless of where they come from, whether that be gender or ethnic background or whatever, have equal opportunities to go to the same school, of course, since, Brown v. Board of Education got rid of segregation. And Title IX allowed it so that people have equal access to be able to play on sports. And so foundationally, these ideas of equality are really important for our democracy. It's worth saying, though, um, that maybe, even though democracy also insists on equal rights and that everybody will be treated equally by police or be treated equally in court, that the way that we look at it now, of course, is sort of a modern view compared to the way that the founders viewed it. Originally, of course, the Constitution and the rights that were put in there were pretty much designed for white men, right? Because slavery was a thing, and women didn't really have the right to vote for a pretty long time. So now, this idea of equality for all in more modern times is kind of extended a little bit more than it originally was. And it's a little bit more inclusive today, but many folks would argue, especially if you follow the news at all, basically, that there's still a lot more progress that can be made in order to make things even more equal for more people in the U.S. So really the next and probably most obvious principle related to democracy is this idea that majority rules. And this idea that we believe that what the majority says goes. That if the most people want a thing, then that's the thing that our country will decide to do. Um, and really this is based on this foundational idea and this principle that democracy essentially says that the majority will be right more often than they are wrong. That a larger group of people will make the correct choice, will make a wise choice more often than a single person would. That just the odds are in favor of a majority making better choices on average. But it's also worth mentioning that democracy isn't really looking for the best solution. Democracy isn't always really great at the best possible solution, but it is really good at coming up with satisfactory solutions. So solutions that are okay and they work pretty well, but aren't always necessarily the best. Democracy, because it waits for everybody to vote, and a lot of people aren't necessarily as well informed as we would like, doesn't work especially efficiently, and there's always room for improvement. And as times change, we need to have opportunity for new answers. But in theory, we definitely believe in this idea of majority rule. That's kind of why we vote, right? But if we are going to believe in majority rule, we also have to make sure we believe in minority rights so that we don't have this majority taking advantage of the minority simply because the minority didn't get what they wanted. So there's this, this image over on the left-hand side that you can see here that says, majority rule only works if you're also considering individual rights, because you can't have 5 wolves and 1 sheep voting on what to have for dinner. When there is a majority, it can be pretty easy for them to take advantage of the minority, right? To make decisions that don't affect everybody. This happened historically, like, with Germany in World War II. The majority really took advantage in a pretty scary way of a weakened population, of a population that was kind of in the minority, right? And so in order to have a democracy, it's really important that we have the ability to protect that minority. And we do it in a few ways. So first, we always allow the majority and the minority to compete in elections equally. That, right now, that the majority, at least according to the most recent vote, elected the Democratic Party, but that doesn't mean that we allow the Republican Party less of a chance to have a candidate, and we don't give them less of a chance to be able to run and get voted into office. We also make it so that we have systems in place to force the majority to have to listen to the minority's suggestions and criticism. Like on the news, regardless of which party is in power, you'll always see people from the opposing party, giving criticism and feedback to help make things better. And it's really important that the majority listen to that feedback because, of course, the next election cycle, the minority might win and become the majority, and then if the previous majority wasn't kind or respectful to the minority, then really they could find themselves really losing out. The next, and I would argue, one of the most important concepts here is this idea that we need to have compromise. And really, compromise is the only way in which we can ever make a decision that allows a majority to make it happen, right? In general, there's never usually 2 options. Like if you're looking at the same-sex marriage type stuff, there wasn't just 2 answers. It wasn't like everyone gets married or no one gets married. There was a bunch of answers in between, right? There was a bunch of different ways in which we can handle marriage law. And so we have to be able to compromise so that, and some people have to be able to be willing to accept solutions that are okay, that are not their most favorite, but are okay in order for us to be able to get a majority to make anything happen at all. It's the only way that we can ever make decisions. Because, of course, we want to make sure that we have a majority, which, of course, is over 50%. We want to make sure that we have a majority of over 50% rather than a plurality make decisions. And what a plurality means, and that's this term right here, is simply the most. And it doesn't have to be a majority. So if there's like 5 different possible options, and one of the options wins because there was 30% of people wanted that, so it was, most people voted for option 1, if it's only 30%, that still means that 70% of the population does not get what they want. And that's insane, right? We have to be able to have the ability to compromise to make it so we can get closer to this majority, to make it so that more people are happy. And of course, you can see in this image that there's this idea that there's your say or my say, but the compromise is somewhere in the middle that allows, both of us to be happy and ultimately come to a common agreement. And that's really important in democracy. And next, of course, we have this idea of individual freedoms. And democracy really insists that everybody have the ability to have a pretty fair amount of freedoms. And this comes, of course, from this idea that people were endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and it's defended in general by the Bill of Rights, which we're going to spend more time looking at later. But there's also this issue that when it comes to government, that we have to be able to balance this idea of people having as much freedom as they want to do whatever they want, with still having enough control to be able to make sure that there's some level of organization and everybody moving in the right direction. Because too much freedom, of course, can potentially lead to anarchy and insanity and just madness happening. But with a compromised choice, of course, we can make it so that we can guarantee that people have as many freedoms as possible while not harming the freedom of others. And really, it depends on who you are, on where you set that line, on where, too much freedom is or not enough control from the government or wherever. And that's kind of a big question that our country has never really answered and continues to grapple with. So expect to hear more about that as the year progresses. And basically, it gets down to this quote that I really like from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is, "The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins." That really, as a government, we try to make sure in compromising these freedoms with order, we try to make sure that everyone can have all of the freedoms that they can have without having so many freedoms that it harms other people's ability to be free, right? So again, it's hard to draw the line, and we're going to continue to debate that. And we'll talk about that probably for as long as the country exists until, some god-awful thing happens and the country no longer exists. But until then, we'll continue to have that debate. But really, as part of trying to make that decision, the democracy was truly chosen as the best way to answer that, as the best way to balance these personal freedoms and public good, is just by giving the question to the American people and seeing what they decide. And as a class, we will continue to have our own discussions on this, and potentially we'll come up with an answer and see what we think it lies. But as for that, those are basically your major concepts of democracy. And we will continue to look at other major things that contribute to the American government in other ways.